Okay, so we have a really interesting topic coming up shortly. We've spoken to our guests before, always a fascinating conversation. I always look forward to speaking to our next guest. It's always a really, really fascinating insight. We're really the cost of divorce. Should I, shouldn't I type thing. So we got relationship expert and psychotherapist Lucy Beresford for the show. Great to have you on board, Lucy.
Oh, thanks, Jimmy.
It's a really interesting one, to be fair. I mean, the cost of divorce. Can you give us a bit of rundown, Lucy, on what the research tells? Obviously, the finance certainly comes into it for sure. I mean, there's probably plenty of people listening to the show probably thinking, don't get married. That's probably your best bet. But for those who are,
Oh, you're such a non-romantic, Jimmy.
exactly.
And I hope your listeners are in a very different frame of mind. But you're right to ask. This research, I think, has some really interesting things to say because it comes from Ashley Madison, and they are the married dating website people. And so what they've been looking at is whether having an affair saves you money in a way. For example, would it be cheaper to have an affair than to get divorced? And what the figures suggest is that actually divorces cost, nearly 9 times as much as having an affair. So just purely in economic terms, purely in the kind of stark numbers of it, it does suggest that actually the real price of a divorce is so much in terms of the expense. Maybe having an affair is a better way of coping with, those unmet needs that often happen in relationships or even just loss of attraction.
Yeah, I mean, that's an important point, I think, Lucy, in the sense that obviously the implications of the affair, the cost. And I suppose, it's one of them, isn't it? So sometimes it might be one of them things where if they can if the couple can sort of carry on afterwards and they're all good with it, then it sort of makes sense in that respect. But does the research say that like people are sort of considering it, Lucy? They are sort of considering saying, you know what, we'll have an affair rather than sort of go through the implications of the cost itself.
Well, certainly members of Ashley Madison have kind of looked at the finances of it and have thought to themselves, it is actually such an expense. I mean, divorce, people are sort of thinking that divorce can come in at around sort of £70,000. And, in the cost of living crisis that we're currently still wading our way through, who's got £70,000 to suddenly pluck out of thin air? So I think when people think about, okay, what are the pros and cons of staying together or maybe having an affair or splitting up? There are these factors that do play a part, and finances are always going to really be something that people will pay attention to, particularly during a cost of living crisis. Of course, there is a third option, which is something that Ashley Madison has done different research on, which is around something called disclosed non-monogamy, which is where you as a couple make a decision that there is going to be an extra party in the relationship. So you disclose the fact that you're not going to stay monogamous. And that again, that's a slightly different dimension to it, where everybody knows what's happening. Um, but even that's a little bit more expensive than just having a sort of plain affair, probably because actually there might end up being two people having non-monogamous relationships, and that's obviously going to be a bit more expensive. You're going to have to,
Mm.
both parties are having dinner with a secondary partner, both parties are buying gifts for a secondary partner. So for sure, the cheapest option in purely monetary terms is having an affair.
It's an interesting one, really, and I think, like you've mentioned obviously the Ashley Madison, and I think for me, sort of reflecting on some of what you've mentioned there, Lucy, I can think to like years ago where people would say, that they'd literally prefer to have an affair than the implications of getting the divorce, that the cost. I guess there's sort of all sorts of figures that you could throw out there. I suppose it depends on the actual person, but in one sense, I suppose it gives people like a situation to put their cards on the table, Lucy, and say, well, this is where I stand, type thing, and providing everyone's happy and agrees, then so be it.
Yes, I think you've raised a very good point there, in as much as do we ever have those conversations where people say, this is how I'm feeling, this is what I want out of this relationship, this is kind of not working for me or no longer working for me? And my observation is that people don't have those don't have those conversations. I'm not quite sure why. It can feel quite sort of intimidating. It can also feel quite combustible. You know, if I have this conversation and I reveal how I feel, I don't know what's going to happen next. Whereas at least if I have an affair and I keep it secret, then I don't rock the boat at home. There are lots of things that don't get to unravel, and having an affair seems like the most stable option, because again, people always assume, people who haven't had an affair, or they hear stories about, for example, celebrities or people in the public eye who've had affairs, people always assume that it's just about sex, but it isn't. And what it often isn't also is about trying to blow up that primary relationship. For a lot of people, having an affair, and I know I've said this to you, Jimmy, before, having an affair is about being able to stay married, because you're not feeling so resentful about the loss of attraction. You're no longer feeling resentful about how kind of taken for granted you might have felt beforehand. Those irreconcilable differences that can propel people into divorce are diluted because someone is having an affair.
Yeah, and that's some an interesting points there you've made there, Lucy. And in terms of, say, the affair itself, you've mentioned there that it's not just about the sexual side of things too, and just with that, I mean, it could be, I'm guessing, like emotional support, maybe just a different perspective, maybe just being with someone for such a long time, you just want to get out there and maybe experience, or just get out there and see what else is out there. So with that, is that sort of, when you mentioned not the sexual part, so it is the emotional part too? It could be just anything really, for and it's just get out there, maybe experience, be with someone different for a little bit.
Yes, although funnily enough, what I've often observed is that when people have affairs, it's not so much difference that they're after. It's more that they are interested in recapturing something of themselves, something in which they maybe feel has got lost in their primary relationship. Maybe they used to be quite fun and now they feel a bit too serious, or maybe they feel underappreciated and therefore they've stopped doing all the wonderful things that they know they're capable of doing in terms of being loving or kind. And then they get into a secondary relationship and suddenly they're back into a version of themselves that they really like, or that they really have missed or want to reconnect with. And I think that can happen a lot with people.
Yes, an interesting point, because I've certainly seen people, Lucy, where they're in a relationship and over time, they just change. Not always for the better, by the way. Maybe they get sort of sometimes, like, a little bit resentful. Maybe they sort of change for various reasons. But I've certainly seen people in relationships of a long period of time who just don't seem to be the same person. I know obviously we all change when we get older and that sort of stuff, really, but they just sort of don't always change for the better, really. I think that it's kind of like the life gets sucked out of them, basically. You think, well,
Yeah.
and they moan about their relationship. The amount of people I know that they'll moan about their relationship, but they'll do nothing about it. And I'm not saying obviously an affair is the be all end all for everybody, but maybe it could be an option. I mean, there are people out there that I certainly know from experience that just moan about their relationship, but they're in it for like years. It's like you think, well, do something about it, whatever it is you need to do.
Yes, kind of put up or shut up, so to speak, as they
No,
say in South Africa. Yeah. Yeah, that
exactly.
sense of actually, and actually, to be fair, some people really enjoy moaning. And
Yeah.
if they didn't have something to moan about, they'd find something else to moan about. And therefore, it may very well be that some people are just chuntering about their relationship because it's the thing that they chunter about. And you, as a friend or a colleague, just kind of have to accept that that's what they're going to chunter about. But there are definitely people who are made unhappy by their relationships. And that's
Mm,
where I often feel that, you know, a good friend or maybe a trusted family member who could just say, have you ever thought of the alternatives? Have you ever thought about the fact that it doesn't have to be miserable, that relationships are actually meant to bring out the best in you? Sorry, intimate
mm,
relationships are meant to bring out the best in you. They're meant to be
yeah.
pleasurable, and they're meant to make you feel almost invincible because somebody loves you and cares for you and supports you. And if you're not getting that, you definitely
Mm,
deserve better.
no, no, 100%. I think that, you know, those sentiments are quite powerful. I have a friend of mine, obviously I won't name names, and she's always talking about how unhappy she is in a relationship. And whenever I've suggested, why don't you look at other alternatives, whatever the alternatives are, and I think that it's almost this hope this person's going to change, and you know, waiting for that person to change. But you could wait a lifetime for somebody else to change. It's one that you can't control anybody else. You can sort of hope and you know that they're going to sort of change. But if that's not happening, then I suppose you know if you're not happy, then it's about sitting down and thinking, okay, well, what are my options going forward? Because life passes you by really, really quickly. To be fair, I think everyone's entitled to have some level of contentness, could be content or happy to a certain degree. But
Oh,
just
listen, I firmly believe you only have one life,
yeah,
and you have to be able to say to yourself, I focused on joy and kindness as much as I could every single day, because otherwise, what is the point? Truly, what is the point? So I think it's
exactly,
really
yeah.
important that people and people listening to your show think quite seriously about, am I happy? And do I deserve better? And that's how you.
Yeah, yeah. Absolutely, that's a great message, a great takeaway. You know, for anyone, especially listening, sort of going into the weekend. You know, am I truly happy? I mean, obviously, everyone's got its ups and downs, but you know, as a general rule, are they? And I think people know intuitively if it's right for them. But I suppose you know we could talk about this, and I'd certainly be interested to talk about this for a long time. But time goes quick. And I want to thank you again, Lucy, for coming aboard the show. And is it once again, if anyone wants to sort of read any research or find out more about Ashley Madison, is there anywhere they can go, Lucy?
Yes, so the website is ashleymadison.com, and they can look on Twitter where I've been posting about it at no, it isn't. It's the at Lucy Beresford. That's right.
Brilliant. Thanks, Lucy. Have a great weekend and speak soon.
Thank you.